I would like to introduce you today to Barry Zigas. Barry is a senior fellow at Consumer Federation of America, where he served as Director of Housing Policy from 2008 to 2019. He also consults with housing and community development, nonprofits, and foundations on strategy, innovation, and leadership through his firm, Zigas and Associates. Barry was Senior Vice President at Fannie Mae from 1995 to 2006, where he led the company's single-family community lending initiatives, as well as corporate and regulatory reporting on the company's housing goals, investments in CDFIs, and support for homeownership counseling and education. He joined Fannie Mae in 1993 as Vice President for Housing Impact. He served as president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition from 1984 to 1993, where he led the efforts to create the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the Home Program, and expanded responsibilities for community lending at Fannie and Freddie, and as Associate Executive Director and other staff positions at the U.S. Conference of Mayors from 1976 to 1984. So welcome, Barry Zigas.
Thank you, Nan. Nice to be with you.
Now, you're a fellow in the Academy of Housing and Communities, which means that you were selected as one of the men and women who have forged public policy and played a big role in the direction of housing and communities. So tell us a little bit more about the role that you played in this arena.
Happy to. I started my career as a journalist, actually, writing for the Housing and Community Development Reporter starting in 1973. And in that role, I was able to cover the creation of the 1974 Housing and Community Development Act, which included the creation of Section 8 and the creation of the Community Development Block Grant Program. And over that period of time, I interviewed lots of leaders in the field, both in Congress and the administration, as well as in outside groups. And by 1976, had decided I really would much rather be involved in making policy than simply reporting on it. And that's when I moved to the Conference of Mayors. And I've been very fortunate over my career to find myself in, you might say, the right place at the right time, to be involved in some of what I think are the most durable and important developments in the field. When I was at the Conference of Mayors, I was part of the team that put forward the ideas for the UDAG program, the Urban Development Action Grant Program, worked with the incoming Carter administration on the second formula for the Community Development Block Grant Program. While I was at the Conference of Mayors, ran a series of training conferences that helped introduce mayors and their community development officials to housing assistance planning. If you may recall that the original Community Development Block Grant had a housing assistance plan requirement. And so I was involved in writing and editing a series of guidebooks and then helping to create and run a series of training conferences for mayors under a HUD contract. I was also the lobbyist for the Conference of Mayors for the last 5 years I was there. And during that period of time, worked to support affordable housing initiatives and also worked with the Carter administration to start developing the first efforts to give local and state governments more control over the allocation of federal housing assistance. And worked with Larry Simons, who was the Housing Assistant Secretary for Housing then. And it was really a breakthrough to have him see how city governments, mayors, and community development directors had a role to play in housing. One of my favorite anecdotes about Larry, who's one of my heroes, was early in the Carter administration, the Conference of Mayors midwinter meeting was held as usual at the L'Enfant Plaza Hotel, and we would invite key leaders of HUD to come meet with the mayors, and I staffed the committee on housing and community development. And Larry came over, he was very gracious, but the first thing he said after the introductions was, I don't understand why you have me here. You need to talk to Bob Embry. I do housing, he does community development. That's what the mayors are involved in. And that was the beginning of a conversation with Larry that turned him into a fierce advocate for more engagement by state and local governments in the allocation of housing resources. At that time, the Legacy Housing Assistance Program, Section 236, public housing, were formed around a direct relationship between the developers, particularly in the private sector, and HUD. City governments, mayors had nothing to say about where the housing got sited, which projects got selected, which priority was given to public housing versus privately supported housing. And mayors were increasingly, at the time I was working with them, finding it very, very difficult to fulfill their obligations under the Community Development Block Grant Program, to have a general overall strategy about improving communities with having no control whatsoever and very little influence over where assisted housing went. And Larry worked with us at the Conference of Mayors to create the Neighborhood Strategies Area Program, which for the first time set aside allocations of Section 8 that could only be delivered through a collaboration with the city governments and state governments, depending on who the awardee was. And while I was at the conference, we ran a series of training conferences to get people up to speed on this program and make sure it got started on the right foot. Unfortunately, when the Reagan administration came in, that program ended, but it was the very first effort to provide more state and local government control over housing resources. And when I continued to work at the Low Income Housing Coalition and had the privilege of serving on the Rouse-Maxwell Task Force, which was a big effort convened with the support of Senator Alan Cranston, who was then the chair of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, one of its breakthrough recommendations was the creation of the HOME program, which in fact placed authority over the allocation of those funds to build and rehabilitate housing directly in the hands of state and local government. And so that was a very durable initiative that I was very proud to have had a chance to play a part in. While I was also at the coalition, perhaps the most durable thing I've worked on in my career was the creation of the low-income housing tax credit. And the tax credit emerged out of struggles around no direct funding for housing under the Reagan administration, which attempted to zero out Section 8 every year it was in office, and a growing exasperation among housing advocates and people serving very low-income people about the lack of support for affordable housing. When tax reform got underway, one of the big fears was that the tax incentives that had been attached to the older legacy program, Section 236 in particular, would be lost. And those were really the only ongoing forms of subsidy for assisted housing at that time. As leader of the Low Income Housing Coalition and with a coalition of other groups, including the Enterprise Foundation, now Enterprise Community Partners, Local Initiative Support Corporation, National Corporation for Housing Partnerships, National Council of State Housing Agencies, we worked to try to reform the existing forms of assistance in the tax code for affordable housing, which were principally accelerated depreciation. We had a concern, however, that those incentives were poorly targeted, not a very long duration, so you could get the benefits without really providing very much housing for very low income people and without having to do so for a very long time. That led to my testifying in both the House and the Senate and introducing the idea in that testimony of shifting to a credit. That got no traction whatsoever in the House, but when the Senate decided to completely rewrite the legislation from scratch, rewrite the tax code from scratch, we had an opportunity, once again, to bring that forward. And the Senate Finance Committee staff really latched onto that because they were very anxious to squeeze a lot of the preferences in the tax code out, but they were also very anxious to protect what subsidies were available for low and very low income housing. That led to a collaboration with Senator George Mitchell, who was really the true champion of this program in the Senate, and his staffer, Bobby Rosen. And together, we managed to create something that has lasted for more than 30 years and created more than 3 million units of housing that's affordable to low and moderate income people, with many of the principles that we at the coalition entered into this conversation demanding. That is, that it served people of much lower income than the prior subsidies. So it went from 80% to 60% of area median, adjusted for family size. It required the subsidy to go only to the units that actually served low and moderate income people, which was a big change, and to require the projects to have a low and moderate income rent restrictions for at least 15 years, which was later extended to 30 years, and in some states were much longer than that. So that one act, that one policy initiative has completely changed the landscape of housing and has proven to be the most durable housing assistance program that we've ever had. Chuck Edson, who's another one of your podcastees, has commented often that the half-life of most traditional housing assistance programs in the U.S. is about 7 years, because that's about as long as it takes for them to be overcome by scandal and mismanagement. The low-income housing tax credit has lasted for more than 30 years and is practically scandal-free. And it represents an amazing collaboration between the public and private sector and has been a tremendous boon to the nonprofit housing sector. When we worked on this legislation, we put in a specific set aside for nonprofit housing developers because we wanted to nurture that rising sector of the industry at that time. When the legacy programs, the Section 236 program in particular, disappeared under the Reagan administration, the large-scale industrial housing producers who had dominated the field up to then pretty much stepped back and left the field. And that left the struggling nonprofits who were then beginning to emerge really free to dominate the whole field. Unfortunately, there was no money and no funding to enable them to do that. And so one of our explicit objectives with the set-aside in both the low-income housing tax credit and later in the home program was to nurture that field. And I think one of the really enduring legacies of all that work is that we have a system now that combines features that I think make the system stable and durable in the sense that we have a mixed economy of for-profit and not-for-profit developers. The social housing sector today in the United States is bigger than it's ever been, with large producers and managers like Mercy Housing, Volunteers of America, and so on. We have private capital married with public subsidies, and we have control in state and local government to allocate the programs as they see fit to meet best the needs of their populations through the qualified allocation plans at the state level for tax credits and through the home program and CDBG. What we're lacking today in the housing assistance arena is the money to make this train run at maximum efficiency and to deliver the best results. And my biggest regret of my whole career here for more than 45 years is that we continue to not get sufficient funding allocated to this very critical need, so that only about 25% of all the people who are actually eligible for Section 8 rental housing assistance, for instance, actually get it. And we have a tremendous crisis in rental housing and a tremendous lack of resources devoted to it.
Well, it's interesting because certainly the fellows that I have interviewed, many of them have said that they feel the tax credit is not the only, but maybe one of the only viable programs today. The concern for funding, now when you say that, do you mean for
Well, tax credit funding is limited, of course, on a per capita basis, so it's capped. That cap is not really increased by any significant amount in most of the life of the program. So it's always oversubscribed. Every state's qualified allocation plan receives far more proposals than they can possibly approve. So there's an overabundance of demand and a constrained supply. That's number one. Number two, as wonderful as tax credits are, they alone do not provide a deep enough subsidy to actually meet the objectives of the program. And so every tax credit project I've ever been involved in, and I was chair of Mercy Housing and on their board for 30 years. I was on the board of Enterprise Community Partners for almost 30 years, very involved in watching and approving and reviewing actual projects. And every one of them requires a wedding cake, a layered wedding cake of subsidies. And it's that lack of subsidy that really starts to pinch. So for instance, when the financial crisis hit, and state and local governments had no more resources to offer, CRA lenders were pulling back, it was extremely difficult to get tax credit projects done. We have a system. I've often joked that I work in an industry where I have the peculiar honor of us honoring the projects that are the most complicated financing stacks that people can imagine. So those are the projects that win all the awards because they have to bring capital in from so many different places. And that just illustrates the point that in spite of the tax credit's value and durability, it alone is not nearly enough. And all of these other sources of funding are highly constrained because they're subject to appropriations, and Congress has continued to refuse to fully fund them at the levels that are necessary. The second issue here is that for most low-income people who are facing rent burdens, they don't need someone to build them a new apartment or a new house. They're already in a place that suits their needs. They're simply paying far too much for it. And if we had more funding in the Section 8 choice voucher program, we could help those people by lowering their rents and enabling them to stay where they are and give them more choice to move to apartments in better neighborhoods if they wanted. And so, that side of the equation has really been neglected. And I think the attention that's been paid to the low-income housing tax credit is deserved, but perhaps overshadows all of the other deficits in the system that are making it so hard to meet the needs of low and moderate income renters.
So do you think the solution to that is simply to increase the voucher program, or is it also lifting or raising the cap?
Well, I think you have to have, yeah, I think the housing program is unique in many ways because, first of all, it's very location specific. So, the analogy that people raise with housing vouchers is that, well, it's like food stamps. Well, yes and no. With food stamps, if there's a problem with not enough Cheerios in the grocery store, you don't build a new grocery store. You give people buying power so that more Cheerios show up. With housing, that's not how it works, right? And so you have a very place-based focus, and historically, the nation's housing policies have been very focused on building and renovating. But we know that there's no possible way to build our way out of the crisis in affordable housing, and it's not necessary because, as I said, most of the low-income people who suffer the greatest rent burdens are living in housing that would qualify for housing quality standards in which they could use Section 8, but they're not allowed to do so and sometimes face the terrible choice of having to move into some new property in order to get the advantage of rent subsidies versus being able to stay where they are if they like where they are and get assistance there. So I think a balanced federal housing policy has to invest in both sides of that equation. And when I served on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Housing Commission in 2011 to 2014, our proposals did exactly that. We recommended a significant increase in the allocations for the low-income housing tax credit, and we recommended the adoption of a policy that would assure every household with an income at or below 30% of area median income, extremely low income under the HUD definition, would guarantee every one of those households with that qualified for it, access to Section 8 assistance. And we priced it out. We estimated how much it would cost. And we argued the case in that report that this would not only solve the most critical housing needs of those facing the most desperate housing burdens, it would also be a significant means to end homelessness because people would no longer be forced out of their homes because they couldn't afford the rent. That was coupling the two sides of the equation. We also made recommendations for modernizing public housing regulations, for fully investing in modernization of public housing, which is a critical national resource, and in addressing some of the barriers that state and local governments have erected that make it very difficult to expand housing supply to meet population growth. So that kind of balanced approach is really what's necessary and has been so lacking in almost every administration that I've worked with over my career.
I'd be curious, because of the difference in your background, looking at things from the federal level and yet looking at things from the Conference of Mayor at the local level, be curious how you feel about HUD's role today, because I keep hearing from a lot of people that they feel that there should be a lot more local input or more guidance toward the local level. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think actually there's an enormous amount of responsibility vested in state and local governments. After all, they control the flow of nearly every dollar of housing assistance outside of the voucher program. They control the allocations of the low-income housing tax credit at the state level. They control how home dollars are allocated. They control now how housing block grant funds are allocated. And so there is an enormous amount of control there. And the fact is that the housing needs of New York City are not the same as the housing needs of Toledo. And that was one of the big drivers of saying that state and local governments need more control over deciding what the priorities for investing scarce dollars are. Is it in rehabilitating smaller properties that are the ones that mostly serve low-income people, or should it be to construct new properties at a much higher per unit cost? That's a decision that requires balancing of factors that the federal government is almost uniquely unable to actually understand. And one of the problems with the earlier housing assistance programs, like 236, was that they were allocated directly between developers who had acquired a piece of property and wanted to build a building with federal support and somebody at HUD who didn't really know anything about the local situation, and the local government had no say over whether that was really the best priority, the best location, the highest use of the funds. So we have a system that has actually devolved since the Nixon administration, frankly, with the adoption of the Community Development Block Grant Program, devolved an enormous amount of responsibility to the state and local level. What's missing, number one, is the funding from HUD, which has been throttled back. And number two, I do think HUD has an important role to play, as it did back in the mid-1970s when it was an active partner with local governments in the Community Development Block Grant Program, with active people in the area offices, with specialists in Washington, who really worked hand in glove with state and local governments to try to maximize and optimize the value of the Community Development Block Grant Program. When I was doing that work at HUD, there were like 15,000 people working at HUD throughout its entire structure. There's now about 5,000. You cannot have an impactful footprint on the problems confronting low and moderate income communities and low and moderate income households, with 1/3 the number of people that we had when HUD launched these programs back in the 1970s. So I think HUD is tremendously constrained by a lack of resources, a brain drain of its most senior and experienced people, and a lack of ability to interact at the level it really should to be a full partner with state and local government. And that has meant that we've really devolved and defaulted to state and local government playing the major role here with very, very little interaction and very little influence by HUD. And HUD itself, of course, is consumed with things that only HUD can do: maintaining the Section 8 program, running the FHA program, running the public housing program. Those are not small things, and HUD is already straining with its constrained budget and staff to do just those things, and it's not doing enough. So my perception of what's happened over the years is that HUD has been whittled down to a shadow of its former self, and the promise of bringing together all the disparate agencies that worked in urban America and rural America back in 1965 when HUD was created has been lost. And the agency today struggles to define its mission, struggles to succeed at its mission, and is viewed by many as a partner with whom you have to work, but not with whom you would choose to work, which is a shame.
It is. I'm looking at what do you think will happen in the future? And one of the things that might make it more palatable to some of the voters on funding, people say it might be better if we didn't just talk about low-income housing, but we talked more about workforce housing and expanded the income range. But by doing that, it's absolutely the opposite of what they were doing in the 70s when they said we want to establish an extremely low income limit, and 75% of the new admissions for vouchers at least have to be extremely low income, which is 30% of median, not 50, not 80, not 120, but what can we do to make it more palatable and get more funding? Would that be an option to increase that, even though it'd be less for maybe this segment?
So this goes back to, inadequate resources. It's very difficult to ask people to sit around a table and allocate scarcity. And that's exactly what we do with housing programs. So a couple of facts that I think help clarify this conversation. 100% of renter income, area renter income, is equal to 50% of HUD's area median income. Right? So when you take HUD's area median income numbers, it combines income from renters and from owners. And so the 50% of area median income is basically, in most areas, 100% of renter median income. So if you're focusing on renters, then the 50% of area median should not be a burdensome requirement. It is focused on renters who are right at the middle of the income range for renters. That gets lost in the shuffle. That's number one. Number two, the Low-Income Housing Coalition was created by Cushing Dolbear specifically around trying to ensure that when Congress was allocating scarce resources, it allocated them first and foremost to those with the greatest need. And that's why we have the targeting we have. And it's very hard to argue that that a marginal dollar should go to a household whose housing needs are not as severe as someone whose income is lower. That's number two. Number three, we spend an enormous amount of money in the United States supporting moderate and middle income households through the homeownership deduction, homeownership mortgage interest deduction, and until the 2017, in the property tax deduction. And those expenditures, which are foregone tax revenues, so it's the same as expenditures, dwarf the spending we have, the outright spending we have on affordable housing for renters. So when people say, well, we're just not doing enough for moderate and middle income people, my answer is, we're actually doing, substantially more, almost twice as much. And we charted this in the VPC Housing Commission report to make the point that part of the conversation here is not simply that we don't have enough resources, but the resources we have are not being allocated necessarily to those who have the greatest needs. So one of the theories behind the low-income housing tax credit was that we would use that tax expenditure to basically foster the development of housing that would be affordable to low and moderate income people. It doesn't require every unit to be affordable to low and moderate income people, and it permits their incomes to rise over time so that they become, in many cases, higher income properties across the board. But we did that because the history of the prior tax breaks was that they were basically squandered on people who were less deserving of the aid, had less of a housing crisis facing them, and cost the same amount of money. So I think it's a balancing act that we have to engage in, and it all comes down to the fact that we're unwilling to allocate a sufficient amount of money to actually solve the problem. One of the impulses behind the Housing Commission's recommendation to create universal access to Section 8 for every eligible household at or below 30% of area median was to be able to say, if you did this, you would actually solve one of the most vexing problems in the housing economy. You wouldn't ameliorate it. You wouldn't make it a little better. You'd solve it. And wouldn't it be great to get behind a policy that for once and for all we could say, because we adopted this policy, we solved a problem. Throughout my career, particularly when I was at the coalition and I would work with foundations to get support for the work we were doing, the question would always arise, well, Barry, if you get your agenda passed, if you get these legislative things done, will it solve the problem? And I was forced to say, no, it will not. And then the question was, well, how long will it take to solve the problem? And my answer had to be, at the rate we're going, longer than any of us are going to be alive. Now, I have to tell you, for foundations, that's not an attractive sell. And frankly, to taxpayers, it's not an attractive sell. And so I think it's counterproductive and self-defeating in some ways that we take these half steps and we spend this money, and then people say, well, you spend all this money and, I still see homeless people. You spend all this money and my children still can't find an apartment they can afford. How are you wasting this money? Well, they're not wasting the money. There's simply not enough of it to go around. And as I said, we're in the business of allocating scarcity. And allocating scarcity is not a fun game to be engaged in.
That's really interesting. What do you think is your one legacy that you would say, this is what it was all about for me?
Well, I would have to say that the low-income housing tax credit, given the role I played in it and how durable it's become, is the achievement I'm most proud of and has had the most impact. But I'm also very proud of the work I did at Fannie Mae, where we struggled to expand homeownership opportunities through offering new mortgage products and working with lenders in the primary market to expand access to low and moderate income people, minorities, communities that have been neglected in the past. And I think a lot of that has been durable in spite of the trouble Fannie Mae got into after I left. And of course, the home program and the revolution in housing finance that placed substantially the lion's share of responsibility for allocating housing assistance so that it could be married with other community development and municipal investments is a very important legacy that I'm particularly proud of.
What advice would you give to young people who are looking at the future, talking about really wanting to solve a lot of the social ills? What would you say to them?
I would say, don't give up hope. All of us old folks who are looking back with you on the ups and downs of our careers are depending on young people to bring new energy, new ideas, new commitment to the field. I would say keep in mind that this work is about providing value to low and moderate income housing consumers, not to provide value to housing producers. Housing producers are the means, they're not the ends. I don't mean they shouldn't get a fair return on their capital, but for too long, I think American housing policy was focused primarily on the producers and what it meant for them, and the consumers were kind of an afterthought and a byproduct of that work. I think we've turned that corner, but it's always important to remember that the whole point of this work is to help low and moderate income households find decent and affordable homes in neighborhoods that serve their needs and allow them to raise their families in a safe environment. That's critical. And finally, I'd say, pay attention to the mistakes we all made in the past. Pay attention to, the vigor with which we pursued direct engagement with developers and some of the problems that created. Be aware of some of the challenges working in state and local government presents. State and local governments have a long history of excluding people minority people, of using zoning and other means to keep them out of the best neighborhoods and the best opportunities. So there's no panacea here. And whichever level of government you work at, it's important to stay focused on the fact that the whole point of this objective is to help improve people's lives, expand their opportunities, and help their children live better lives than they did.
Well, you certainly have done a lot when you think about, how you champion many of the low-income people, that you've done that through a variety of means. The fact that you have created the tax credit program, I mean, that still exists today. I mean, it's one of the very few that has stood the test of time that people still think of as favorable. So you have a lot of credit due to you.
Well, thank you. And I've been reviewing the other folks on this podcast and my colleagues in the Institute. One of the things that you can't be emphasized enough is that every one of the people that you're featuring in this series has made a significant contribution. All of us have worked with one another. The story of this work is about coalitions. It's about finding common interest. It's about marrying those interests in ways that gets to a common outcome that's beneficial for everyone. And all of us have contributed to that. I was just very fortunate to be in the various positions I had at specific times when there was an opportunity to do something bold and innovative. And it would not have happened without the collaboration of many of the other people you're interviewing and many people you're not interviewing, who are out there in the trenches doing the work. So I'm very proud of what I've done, but I am humble in my sense that I'm just part of a larger community of people that have spent their lives trying to get this done.
Well, thank you for your advice today, your thoughts today, and for being part of that community.
Well, thank you for giving me the chance to reminisce about my misspent youth.